Welcome to the Finer Femininity Catholic Women's Podcast, a podcast for Catholic women with traditional values, women who are striving for sanctity, learning to be more joyful and feminine in their vocations by studying Our Lady, the saints, and revered Catholic men and women. And now your host, mother of 11, grandmother of 26, Leanne Vanderputten.
Today I'd like to talk to you about a rule of life. There's going to be two parts, and this first part is an excerpt from the Counsels of Perfection for Christian Mothers by the very Reverend P. Lejeune. And I'd like to remind you not to get discouraged as I read this little passage about a rule of life. This is something we strive for. It is an ideal, but we must always remember what St. Francis de Sales said, to be patient with all things, but especially with ourselves. So I'd like to read you this, and then I'm going to talk to you a bit about my own rule of life. The need of a rule of life. Have you a rule of life? Do not say that a rule is possible for a religious, but impossible for the mother of a family. This is an error. Every woman, whatever her lot in life and whatever her obligations, ought to have a rule of life. Of course, the rule of a religious will be less open to modification and will entail greater precision and severity than yours. Nevertheless, you must have a rule, otherwise your life will be squandered in 1,000 follies and futilities. Need this rule be written? When written, it will have much more precision than if it were only in the memory. But do not imagine that it should cover many sheets of paper. A few simple resolutions, clearly stated, will be entirely sufficient. You need not overburden yourselves in the beginning. Go forward step by step. A rule is not immutable. We can always add to it according as divine grace directs us. Indeed, it is better to add to a rule than to subtract from it. So it is better to begin at a moderate pace than to be obliged to slacken our speed and perhaps lose heart. Let me call your attention to the advantages of a rule of life. First, it saves you from yourselves, so to speak, from the spirit of caprice which finds its way so easily into your actions, and robs you of the greater part of your merit. We are all tempted to do only what pleases us, and to avoid sacrifices as much as possible. An act needs but to take on the appearance of duty to become an object of aversion to us. The result is that unless you are bound by a rule, your lives will drift unceasingly. They will float along, guided only by caprice, and the sense of duty will be almost entirely lost. In that case, it is your own will that you have followed from morning until evening, and not the will of God. From the viewpoint of merit, what a sad life it is that is not regulated. It is a life which, from a worldly standpoint, may have a certain respectability, but which, from the supernatural side, is a mere farce. Will you tell me what that day weighs in the divine balance, during which you follow your own will with never a thought for the will of God? The evil of our century is precisely the absence of the supernatural in life. It is this naturalism, this worldliness, that draws Christian souls back to the ideals which honest pagans formerly conceived at Rome or at Athens. Do you imagine that you can combat this naturalism by leaving your life unbridled, so to speak, without a bit to restrain it, or a rule to regulate it? I have no hesitancy in saying that a life without a rule is a life wherein the supernatural, that is, the part of God, has little or no importance. Here is another advantage of a rule of life. There are many bound by a rule whose lives are very fruitful. She who lives by a rule finds time for everything. Such a life produces its effects much more quickly and with less fatigue than a life without a rule. Ask any Christian mother who accomplishes an astonishing amount of work, yet never has an air of depression. Ask her, I say, the secret of her activity. She will tell you that she works methodically because she is guided by her rule. Others, though always occupied, accomplish little because they follow the inspiration of the moment. When, perchance, they have finished a work, they lose a quarter of an hour asking themselves what to do next. Then they attempt something, leave it unachieved because it has suddenly become distasteful to them, pass to another work, return finally to the first, and, in the end, accomplish nothing. True, they have been occupied continually, but they may have been badly occupied, and have succeeded in making everyone around them discontented. Now, the ridiculous part of all this is that instead of laying the fault to themselves, they feign to be misunderstood, and accuse their husbands of not rendering justice to their tact. If you desire me to draw up for you the essentials of your rule, I will say that you should first determine the hour of your rising and retiring. Do not remain undecided on this important point. The rule extolled by spiritual writers as well as by physicians is to retire early in order to rise early. Here is another article that ought to find its place in your rule. Morning and evening prayers should be said kneeling. Moreover, there is hardly one among you who cannot spend a quarter of an hour each day in spiritual reading. You should have a special article binding you to that. Those of you who have the time and who are unwilling to be satisfied with merely earthly piety ought to take measures to make a meditation every morning, and also to attend Holy Mass each day, or at least several times during the week. Do not forget to receive the sacraments. But of all the articles, this will be the one most subject to modification. The more often you communicate, the more ardent will your desire for the Holy Eucharist become. It will be necessary, therefore, to modify your rule more and more frequently in regard to the reception of the sacraments. I will propose this rule for the distribution of your time. Give your attention, above all, to the most important duties. I mean those of your interior and station in life. Then attend to the less important duties. The remainder of your time may be spent on duties of pure decorum, if any more time remains. Since your rule has been made for God, it is for God that it should be followed out. This rule is the expression of the will of God in your regard, which must of necessity be very dear to you. Bring then to the accomplishment of each of these articles a true spirit of faith and a truly supernatural motive, and place yourselves 100 times daily under the eye of God, saying frequently to him with love, "All for you, my God." So that was from the book Counsels of Perfection for Christian Mothers. And before I begin this little excerpt about my own rule of life, I would like to say that I have one maxim that I go by, and I remind myself of it often. It is, people are more important than things, and schedules, and accomplishments, etc. That being said, these are my thoughts on a rule of life. I never heard of this term before until I picked up the book A Mother's Rule of Life several years ago. I lived it to a certain extent already, but didn't know what it was called. One thing I so appreciated from that book was the part on the spiritual life. She talked about tithing your time to God. She suggested a certain amount of time, 10% of your waking hours, that you dedicate to God, which I thought was pretty neat. It gave me something to go by and some kind of a goal. It was then that I began to journal or write down my list on the spiritual things I wanted to accomplish throughout each day, and I would check them off as I went along. I was hung up on the numbers for a while, making sure I got my tithing in, and then eventually that part fell by the wayside. This began a habit in me that I have practiced for many years now, the writing down of what I wanted to accomplish spiritually each day. And this list-making reached out into other aspects of my life. I firmly believe the spiritual duties we do each day are the foundation of any rule of life. It is at the top of my page each day in my journal. My morning prayers, those are said privately, daily Mass if possible, with the children, and then the Mercy Chaplet with the children again, our family rosary with the family, and night prayers, which are private. So there's 5 things on the top of my page, which is my spiritual list. Now, in order to accomplish our spiritual things and the other things we need to do each day, we've got to take care of our body. How will we say our 15 minutes of morning prayer, if that's what we have committed to, if we don't get to sleep at a decent hour? It is valuable to put a time for rising on our list and sticking to it as much as we can. This will be difficult if the time for going to bed is ignored. In the evening, there may be extenuating circumstances in raising a family, but we have to admit a lot of the time we bring our fatigue on ourselves, and I'm talking to myself here. We lollygag at night, putting off going to bed for whatever reason, and then guess what? We're too tired the next morning to get up and start the day right with the first thing on our list, which is our morning prayers. And then it goes downhill from there. So remember, your accomplishments during the day and how well the day turns out begin the evening before. So I have my spiritual list. It has 5 things on it. And then I have my bodily or health section. It's simple and doable. I have exercise, and that for me would be either T-tap, which is a form of exercising, a walk, treadmilling, etc. And then I have take supplements. And then I have water, which I try to drink half my body weight in ounces. And then you can add what time to bed, what time for rising, and anything else that is important to you in this category. Remember, check them off as you do them. Next is your household duties, the important stuff. Write it down. Mine probably looks different than yours because I have girls who take over some of the big things. Here's an example of what yours can begin with. Meals, school, laundry, and then you can add to this section of your list as you see fit, but just the important things, the must-dos. And then as you make your meals, actually I would break it down to, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or whichever ones you do make yourself, and then check them off. So make sure you're checking things off. Keep things picked up in between time. Maybe plan a 20-minute hoopla with the kids as everyone takes a room. This could be done more than once a day and added to your list. And then added to the bottom of your list, one big thing, like maybe you have to clean the fridge. But do that big thing only for 15 minutes. You will be surprised how much you get done in 15 minutes. So you do the 15 minutes each day until that job is done. Set the timer. Oftentimes we can't make it through a whole big job, and we tend to avoid it if it is big. So break it up into doable slots of time. I'm always amazed at how much I get done in 15 minutes and how quickly these big jobs get accomplished. A great feeling indeed. I think this is valuable too. Zig Ziglar, you may have heard of him, he's a big guru in the positive motivational field, said to plan into your schedule time with your family. Yes, I know as busy mothers we are always with our family, working hard for them each day, rubbing shoulders with them, etc. But maybe we could write down 20 minutes with the kids and spend that time building Lego, reading a story, telling a story, crafting, or whatever. Those are the kind of things that, built into your rule of life, you will never regret. Remember, write it down. So, a recap of your categories on your list. You're going to have your spiritual duties, your bodily health, the most necessary housework things that we can't not do, one big thing for 15 minutes, time with family, and then other things you'd like to accomplish. Just to mention, try to get a little breather for yourself each day, whether it is doing a bit of crocheting or looking up a special website online. It's important that we recharge too. All the other little things you have to accomplish each day can revolve around this list. This is your go-to, your foundation. It won't be perfect, and that's okay. And you can write the little things down too. It's great when we get to check things off. And if you don't get them done that day, put them on the next day and try again. I urge you then, ladies, to adopt a rule of life, a doable one that also challenges you. Write it down. Start now, and you will reap great benefits.
Thank you for joining us today. Please stop by the Finer Femininity website to enjoy articles on the single life, the married life, raising children, and the spiritual life, all written by solid Catholic authors. You can follow Find Your Femininity on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. God bless you, and see you next episode.